Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti questa mattina all'incontro che apre la seconda giornata del meeting e che
Okay, good morning and welcome to the second day of the meeting. We will be discussing a crucial topic for the future of our country. And I would like to thank the meeting organizers for adding this to a very full program with such an interesting subject to discuss. I would like to thank the discussants today, and in particular, Minister Graziano Delrio, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, who accepted to be here today. To be here today as a key counterpart on such a crucial issue. We will be talking about the future, of course, but it's something that's related to recent events crucial to reconstruction activities which are being discussed and decided on in Rome. Today we'll be talking about the need to regain skills. Our country has always been exposed, if you like, to the danger of earthquakes. We have this risk at all levels. We have a civil protection service, which is very advanced. We have engineering services, architects, businesses, but our area is very, very complex, not only because it is a seismic area, but also because of its mountain features. 8,800 municipalities, villages. It's very, very difficult to act rapidly in case of emergency, but also it is very, very difficult to deploy prevention plans which really allow for a reduction of the seismic risk. What data show us clearly is that most of the human-related costs are so dramatic, but also economic costs sustained by our country because of earthquakes could have been, I won't say reduced to zero, but reduced dramatically if more money had been spent in prevention. And that is what, at the end of the day, we all hope and wish and try to build based on the experiences and skills, but also the mistakes of the past, if you like. Let's move on to our presentations. We have here three discussants from three perspectives in the area. Fabio Cerchiai, who is now president of Atlantia Spa and Autostrade per l'Italia, representing the world of businesses, advanced infrastructures that are able to build something that resists and is not afraid of earthquakes. Massimo Ghini is an architect and designer at international level, and one of those who have studied most in-depth solutions, reliable solutions as for earthquake prevention. Emanuele Orsini, chair of FederlegnoArredo, who will be talking about building construction made of wood, which is particularly important for prevention, and also as regards training in traditional crafts for new needs. So I'll leave them the floor for a few minutes, then Minister Delrio will say a few words based on what the others have said, and then we will conclude. I would like to start with President Cerchiai, who is also talking about skills and heritage as another competence which I think might be useful here. That is to say, he has worked in insurance. He has been the president of Italian insurers, and we know that insurance policies against disasters are a significant financial issue. Not in order to prevent risk, but to help the system face the costs. So the floor to President Cerchiai. Thank you. Yes, the microphone is off now. Thank you very much. The topic of our meeting, 1 year after the dramatic earthquake in central Italy in 2016, is totally relevant and topical today. So before talking about prevention, the main priority is what we are dealing with in terms of civil protection, volunteers, individuals and companies. That is to say, safety measures and reconstruction in the areas. My company has contributed, like many others, in the effort towards helping solve such a dramatic situation, which needs to be considered as part of everyone's concern. We try to make available human resources and means, also in agreement with the local government authorities and with the Civil Protection Service. We know there are bureaucratic difficulties sometimes which interact and jeopardize our best efforts. But with this common effort, we have managed to reconstruct 30 kilometers of roads, to remove blocks of snow, and to allow for a whole set of measures which are indispensable for a community which is hard hit, has been so hard hit by this catastrophe, and we are responsible for this, for their safety and protection. But all this happens when there is an emergency. In an emergency, we see a tragedy, we share it, and we are driven towards trying to make other people's problems a part of us. So what is being discussed today, prevention and safety measures at a regional level, following up on the tragic events in central Italy, before that in Emilia, and then in L'Aquila before that, we need to find a sense of solidarity, not so much in emergency, but as a routine. The key word here is prevention. Making the area safe. As Luciano said at the beginning, you can't prevent calamities. I worked in insurance, as he said, and I studied the problem in great detail. You can't prevent this in a country such as ours, where 67% of municipalities is at danger of earthquakes. 45% of Italian municipalities is at risk of flooding. Landslides, volcanoes are related to more concentrated areas, but it's a fact. It is a reality where politics, policy making play a central role, but they can't be left alone. The first of these reasons is, it might not be nice to hear, but it's the problem of public budget. It's not something external to us, it's something that involves all of us. So we need to take account of this. We cannot consider it an expectation on the part of policymakers. It's in everybody's interest to recognize rules and apply them. So within this framework, the drive should come from the community. We've talked a lot about prevention. Just think that the expenditure related to reconstruction of residential buildings, that's a small part of the damage caused by disaster, but in a year is or accounts for about 3 billion euros in the past few years. So we need to identify suggestions to allocate these 3 billion euro, which come from taxpayers' money. From everybody's funds, basically. They could be or should be used for prevention. Of course, policymakers need to do the rest. I would like to say this to the minister. We need the right rules. They should be strict, but not too complicated. They have to be complied with. Being a president of Autostrade per l'Italia, I have learned the difference between planning investment and investing. Planning investment is a semi-accounting operation. Investing is an industrial business operation. It means doing. So I think that politics will always find it difficult to introduce a new item of expenditure which would increase taxes, because either we start from the assumption that taxpayers' money are not used properly. Of course, they can be used better, but there are thousands of problems: pensions, healthcare, youth employment, a whole set of issues. We need to identify extraordinary resources, and the community could give the input to politics. It would almost be like popular-based legislation. I know that it's complicated to establish a sort of mandatory expenditure for prevention exclusively. It's not easy, but unless we do this, we will never succeed. We need to manage strategy in a way which is based of intervening in good time. We cannot act only in emergencies. We need to face emergencies. We have done so also in the greatest time of difficulty, but we need to act in advance. As Luciano was saying, disasters can't be avoided, but their consequences can be reduced. I'm not only talking about economic consequences, relevant as they may be, but I'm talking about the inestimable loss of human lives. An earthquake such as the one that hit Central Italy last year in Japan would not cause any victim or serious damage. Of course, countries have a history. We have such a beautiful, long-standing history and such a heritage which is so different than other countries. It's not a term of comparison. It's not to say that they are better than us. It's a challenge to find solutions for issues which should be based on smart cooperation between public and private entities, where companies play their role. We as individual citizens should contribute in emergencies when there are disasters. I can't understand why we should not be so much willing to contribute when we talk about prevention. So setting up a fund of this kind, Luciano mentioned my previous work in insurance, and I would like to mention what is done in other countries, public-private partnership insurance. Bear in mind that currently, as far as I know, the insurance against earthquakes and flooding covers only 2% of houses in Italy. And the normal policy against fire, the most basic risk, covers only 40% of residential buildings. So insurance can be useful, but it's not a panacea unless insurance is made mandatory or semi-mandatory, as is the case in France, most notably. So It's not so much an extraordinary risk for company. The state could play the role as reinsurer. If things go very badly, it chips in, but it receives if they go well in terms of the premiums which are returned. It's the French model, the model used by many countries, in Romania, to mention but one, emerging countries in this case. So I strongly believe that for any government, I think I can say this quite safely, Mr. Minister, the idea of something mandatory for citizens has been the subject of many suggestions in Parliament, and they never see the light. Our role as citizens or companies is to remove this fear. We can do this together well, and I think we have all the possibilities in such a beautiful country as ours, where engineering companies are greatly efficient, where civil protection services work every day and are a benchmark for the rest of the world. We have the prerequisite for this to happen. Thank you very much. President Cerchiai, as you heard, there are interesting points to think about. Massimo Iosa is an architect and designer, as I said before. He is very interested in combining also in the area of prevention, safety and quality of the buildings, his sensitivity as a creative professional. Thank you.
Grazie per questo invito che mi è stato.
Thank you for your invitation, which gives me the opportunity to talk about a very topical theme, something that has emotional repercussions on all of us. While I was driving here, I was thinking that we need to be careful in choosing our words, because obviously there is a technical part of this theme, but there is also a very strong human component that needs to be taken into careful attention. So today I will be talking about the technical part, because as Italian architects, we have a vision that is devoted to the building of quality buildings. So we have developed engineering mechanisms that put together the technical part and the creative, so to speak, part, which gives a particular value to our everyday life. So we have two main needs in terms of prevention. That is to say, prevention linked with engineering, because it is by good engineering that you can actually have prevention. And then there is also the safeguard of the existing architectural heritage. So there are two different aspects that have some points in common. And I'll show you a few slides. So there are some principles that are not so difficult to understand, as you might see here on the slide. As you see here in the upper part of the slide, we have the need to develop buildings that are, well, compact. So particular geometries that are particularly complex is open to the risk of breaking. So the starting elements are very simple and are actually linked with the shape of the building. And also in terms of height of the building, we need to take into account that the structure needs doesn't have to be empty spaces, and it needs to be compact. It is more secure this way. If it is more homogeneous, both in terms of internal frame and of external brickwork. And so here we have some examples. A building with the heavy part in the upper part is obviously more prone to risk than a building where the heavier part is at the bottom. So, well, this doesn't mean that we cannot build quality buildings, expressive buildings. This can be done, but we need to adopt some rules which are quite simple. A structural joint, for instance, which is an element that makes it possible for the components of the building to move without causing any fracture. You see here in this attic that there is this flexible part so that the building can actually move. So this central part, which is made of rubber material, is quite flexible, so it can actually move. Same thing for vertical structures. Here again, we can create this vertical joint so that when the building moves, it doesn't break. We have some buildings like this one with what we call the knots that are at the corners of the building. They need to be very solid, very rigid, because the whole box, so to speak, needs to move as a whole. So you can see an ordinary knot that is developed in steel, and here this is a earthquake-proof joint with a certain quantity of metal. Another strategy that is often used is the isolation at the bottom of the building by introducing a flexible plan between the foundations and the ground. Something similar to the mobile joint is this dissipator, which is an element that avoids the deshaping of the structure. Materials, well, obviously there is armed concrete that can be developed in a way that it has more metal in it than the brickwork, which is made of small elements. The whole stonework can actually be at risk, but stonework and brickwork can actually resist seismic pressure, but it needs to have elements that make it more compact. So the part of the top layers needs to be very compact, and there needs to be also a steel layer inside. Then there is the frame brickwork, which is often used for this kind of building. Then we have obviously have steel, because steel absorbs, so to speak, the seismic movement. It can actually maintain the resistance of the box, even if it can, in a way, be deformed. Then there is wood, which is becoming more and more frequently used because, well, it can be used quickly because it is extremely efficient, and it also has another fundamental characteristic. So that is to say, it is possible to reassemble wood with a precision that you cannot actually reach with other materials. And this also enables the control, the preemptive control of deformation. Another kind of project of theme is that of restructuring the existing buildings. Because obviously we cannot only deal with new buildings. On the other hand, or rather in Italy, it is more important to concentrate on existing buildings. We have three different strategies. So there is the adjustment strategy. Here we need to reinforce the building if we want to make it higher, or if we want to enlarge the building with other buildings that would be connected with the existing one, or if we want to change the purpose for which the building is used with an increase in the load above 10%. Or we can talk about improvement, which is an intervention that aims at improving the resistance of existing structures and the reinforcement that actually works on some details like the knots we were talking about before. An existing building, these are the most critical points. A critical point that has been often mentioned and sometimes in the wrong way is the curb.
Ecco, il cordolo ha una funzione importantissima.
Curb plays a very important role because it creates a box that keeps up the roof. Otherwise, it can collapse, and the walls at the sides can also collapse. So this is extremely important. Another important element is the slab, the base in armed concrete, which obviously can reinforce, but if there is an earthquake, the building becomes too heavy and it can collapse. When we make an evaluation of a building, we need to take into account the windows, because if they have been moved over time, this leads to a lower quality of the structure. These are very irregular structures that I showed you in the previous slide that are prone to collapse. Walls can be tight so that they do not open up, and then we have the frames, St. Andrew's cross frames. These are metal structures that are positioned on the existing walls, turning them into something that is solid. There is another thing that is very expensive in terms of requalification of existing buildings, is the creation of skates in order to isolate the building from the ground. There is a technology that I really like to use, is that of the carbon fiber reinforce. That is to say, when we have structures that are not very stable, we actually create a sort of a bandage of the existing structure with the carbon fiber, which is extremely resistant. And this can be done at the knots, which are an element that is often neglected, actually, but they're extremely important because the knots need to be extremely resistant. But we can also bandage pillars. We can bandage whole walls. So we saw this already. These are the seismic dissipators that are used in Italy in different circumstances. They are actually, they were created in Japan. And, well, I think that the Japanese experience is of great inspiration for us because the Japanese started to develop these anti-seismic technologies from the 60s onward. The most interesting elements are these buffers that are, so to speak, smart buffers that use an algorithm to contrast the waving movement of the earthquake. So it's something that gives a counter movement to that of the earthquake. And then we have the seismic isolator, which is again, well, a buffer, a passive buffer. Another technique of the tuned mass damper is the creation of a weight at the center of the building that guarantees stability because it counters the earthquake movement. So the center of balance is actually lower, and this counters the effect of the seismic event.
Chiedo scusa. Allora, ecco, fantastico, comunque siamo quasi alla fine, ecco, grazie. Allora, giusto per completare.
Just to complete this picture, this FT pillar technique is something that I really recommend because it puts together the characteristics of steel, so it's a metal structure that is filled with concrete. So it puts together the characteristics of the two materials, the positive characteristics of the two materials with these steel pillars. And then, well, just an example, a very brief one, because I don't think we need to talk about techniques and nothing else. This is an example of urban reconstruction after the earthquake in 2010 in the city of Constitución, where architect Ravenna, who became very famous after this project, had this very simple idea. So there is a certain part of technology. It is a wood technology, because as I said, wood is a very good material to develop a rapid response to earthquakes, which lasts in time. So what did the architect do? He built just half of the house. The other half is then developed by the people living in the house,
Di chi è entrato, perché
which actually was very well appreciated by those who went to live there. And this actually increased the value of the house over time, because from 50 square meters, it was developed up to 90 meters. So I brought this example to your attention because I think that we needed to go beyond the technical aspects and try to find new ideas. Well, of course, in a situation of emergency, it is not easy to keep an open mind and to face all the different difficulties that derive from an earthquake. But we need to do this. We are Italians, so this is part of our way of being. And another example is the structure the wood structure in Amatrice, where there is also an architectural element. Stefano Boeri created this element that was inserted in this square of the restaurants area in Amatrice. So, well, we also need these elements that make us think that we are going back to a human way of living after an earthquake. I added also this project because it is an extraordinary project that was carried out this year in Portland. The material is wood again, and this is going to be the highest wood building in the world, 12 floors, with a frame structure that is similar to a steel structure with a specific thicknesses and technologies. And you can see here an image of the final structure. And this is one of my projects. It's called People Mover, and it was developed. It has been developed since 2006, and we are about halfway there. So we have, so to speak, an itinerary with a bridge over the motorway A1 with environmental friendly stations that develop or rather produce the energy needed by trains, and they are also in a certain balance with the surrounding green areas. So, well, there are a series of seismic standards that are obviously respected in building these structure, which is completely engineered. But at the same time, we worked at the project with an idea. This itinerary is 6 meters high, and the part underneath this tunnel needs to be a very light part, even though it is actually the heavy part, the part of the foundations, whereas the upper part is made of metal, in order to have a low center of gravity for the whole structure, so that we can have an eventual response in case of earthquake. So this is something that I was mentioning before with reference to the engineering part. We architects need to pay attention to all the aspects concerning qualification of spaces and costs, but I firmly believe in the fact that an architect develops a space not for himself, not to show off, but for the people who are going to use it. People need to live better in these spaces, in these structures. That is our mission from my point of view. So we really try to do our best. Thank you. Thank you, architect. Then Minister Delrio can tell us something more about the choice of certain technologies in the earthquake hit areas And now we leave the floor to Emanuele Orsini, who's the president of Federlegno. And among so many interesting things that the architect mentioned, we saw that wood is a very good anti-seismic material, a natural material, obviously. So obviously, President Orsini will have some more to say.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. When I saw the architect's slide, I saw plenty of concrete. So I thought I need to convince him to use wood. At the end of my presentation, I hope that the next presentations of his will include, or wood will feature much more prominently. First of all, what is FederlegnoArredo? Then I will talk about prevention, which is the core part of our meeting today. FederlegnoArredo represents 79,000 companies, 320,000 people, and a turnover of about 41 billion, and exports 121 billion abroad. We are the best part of Italy worldwide. 16% of Italian companies, 80% of workers in industrial companies, about 4-5% of GDP in Italy, so a substantial figure. Going back to today's topic, I think that we don't have really the best material. We have the material for the best use. Looking at my friend Massimo's slides at the beginning, he showed nodes, and I immediately was reminded of the question of why does wood work so well? You will all have held a hammer in your hand in your life, but maybe you haven't asked yourselves, why is the handle made of wood? Because it dampens shock. If you pick up a hammer with an iron handle, you will realize what it means to hit something with an iron hammer. So it helps dampen blows and shocks, and that's why it's so good as an anti-seismic material. Building using wood also means building working quickly. We have companies today building schools in 72 days. Record times. We have buildings which are Class A, eco-friendly, so they are zero energy consumption. We have companies that are building in emergency areas about 10 finished homes a day. So it's a large amount of work. Companies have participated in reconstruction in all earthquakes, starting from 1976 in Friuli to the latest ones, in the most recent in L'Aquila. In L'Aquila, we had 4,000 buildings collapsed, and we had about 2,000 buildings reconstructed. In Emilia-Romagna, about 70% of schools have been reconstructed using wood. The same can be said about the reconstruction of living modules. So building with wood is, of course, rapid, and also it means safe building sites, because it means having products that have such a high engineering content and so well designed that, as the architect was saying, it's just like using Lego bricks. If you use these products, the staff is working in safe conditions. Also, this is important because you need to think about the future. We talked about the future of young people. In the title of the meeting, mention is made of a heritage. Wood also means low CO2 emissions. Building using iron or concrete. I'm not an enemy of either of these materials, beware, but I am aware that building with wood means, with a product of about 1 cubic meter, with any other kind of material, means consuming 1.1 tons less of CO2. So we need to think about European parameters, so we need to pay great attention to our future. Of course, we should not forget that companies today are using casings based on European concepts, regulations passed in 2012, where new buildings will have to be zero consumption, zero energy buildings. This has been done in Emilia-Romagna and Lombardy. By 2018, all new buildings, public buildings, will have to have these characteristics. So we should not forget that we need to keep the European pace. We must consider the importance of reducing energy consumption. Last but not least, someone says to me, using wood means depleting woodland, cutting down forests. But Italy, or 33% of Italy, about 11 million hectares, is forested. In Italy today, the consumption of our woods accounts for about 20%. So in Europe, use of forest is about 60%. We import raw materials into Italy, accounting for 80%. This means buying about 8 billion raw materials from abroad. So it means creating 160,000 workplaces and safeguarding mountain communities, and also giving a prospect for our Apennines. This is important. Part of the reconstruction effort in the Marche, Lazio region, Abruzzo region, Umbria too, can use wood from those areas. This means, of course, starting from an assumption, using wood. We are working with the current government, represented also by the Minister of Agriculture. There should be a new law passed concerning the use of raw materials in Italy. I don't want to think, I'm sorry to think that Italy is such a high importer of wood from the Czech Republic or neighboring countries, because we can't keep our wood areas clean and tidy. Also, there's the issue of fires, because not enough care is being taken of our forests, and also the issue of the lack of water resources, because water is used improperly. So we need to consider 3 elements. This is what we have been doing at FederlegnoArredo. We need to make sure that politics have a long-term project, because believing in the woodland system means that entrepreneurs, businesses should work together. We need to have a synergy in the supply system. We need to create protocols, work together again, because in this way we can create a country system which is missing now. It's as if you had 3 children and 2 of them work and 1 doesn't. But we need to regenerate all parts of the economy. Also bear in mind that Italian woodland, to produce a 100 square meter house, takes 15 seconds. In 15 seconds, Italian woodland regenerates raw materials for a house of this size. So we can produce 2 million houses a year. We presented through our Excellent Study Center a report on the use of wood for building in Italy in 2015-2016. We have built homes, or 3,400 housing units. We have a potential for more people to work and hiring people, and at the same time we could be able to regenerate a piece of the economy which is now dormant. Going back to the issue of training, to conclude, yesterday Prime Minister Gentiloni mentioned the fact that the new financial compact also includes issues related to youth employment and young people in general. We are investing in this regard. 5 years ago, we built a hub, FederlegnoArredo hub near Seveso, where we focused on employment. This is a school which is being expanded. There'll be a second version inaugurated in November or December for about 280 students. And the most interesting thing is that they have classes of groups of 30, and they all find employment at the end of their training because there is so much synergy between the business world and education. So it's all interconnected. And this means that a synergy is created. Students understand what and why they are studying. They get to know the companies where they'll be working through work experience. And we also need to consider that it's a changing world. By 2020, we'll have about 24,000 people going into retirement. 24,000 people retiring, and 31,000 people hired by 2020, so plus 7,000. We need to invest. We are investing. About 70% of our companies invest 2% of their turnover. It's not a high figure, but we have many companies investing. Industry 4.0 has been an important step for us because our businesses are being upgraded, and there's no longer division between Italy and Europe. We have efficient factories, and so we are able and ready for the future. We invest in human resources. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Orsini. Yesterday, we talked about furniture, the furniture industry, with Prime Minister Gentiloni as a branch of the industry which has been able to upgrade, if you like, and change to meet the needs of, for example, the advent of IKEA. Now, I would like to leave the floor to the Minister. We have virtually on our desk a set of dossiers, and so Mr. Cerchiai mentioned the question of resources. He suggested purpose-made tax, if you want to call it this way, or mandatory insurance, as happened in France. Architect Iosa Ghini talked about, in a very interesting way, about new technological developments or existing technological possibilities, which are in most cases up to free initiative. And finally, President Orsini talked about wood and its industry. Before leaving the floor to the Minister, maybe not everyone will remember, you wouldn't ask me for this, but I am pleased to do this because you need to say things clearly. 7 years ago, the Agenzia del Territorio presented the results of its first survey, aerial photographic survey in our country, reported 2 million phantom buildings. That is to say, had plots with buildings that were not registered. So we are talking about a country, of course, bearing in mind the differences between Centre, North and South, an area which is very complex in terms of mountain areas. It's very old, has long-standing heritage, but also illegal building is rampant. And also this has an impact, has had an impact in recent cases. So the government, or the government's minister that he has been involved in, or when he was mayor, is lagging. Today we have attempts such as Casa Italia, or the reforms of public administration, the issue of maintenance, which has always been very important for you, they are certainly new, but they are not enough. So I now leave the floor to Minister Delrio.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Today's topic is rich in different implications from the technical point of view, from the financial point of view, but this topic needs to be dealt with in a very sincere, truthful way. Otherwise, we would be looking for simple solutions, but we would not see the cultural problem that is part of this situation. We are a very fragile country, and this is something we need to reiterate. We are a very fragile country. 80% of the municipalities have a hydrogeological risk area. 10 million houses are within a seismic area of medium and high risk. 1/3 of the Italian people live in a risky area. So, well, we need to open our eyes, and as Mr. Cerchiai was saying, we spend an awful amount of money to repair the damage. He talked about over 3 billion euros. Now, actually, we are at 4.5 billion because with the earthquakes and the hydrogeological problems, we have been spending about 4 billion a year recently. And this is a theme that is extremely important. So, going back to saying, you learn more by preventing than by curing. So, well, this is a country that needs to have plans and programs, and it is true that planning is easier than doing, especially in Italy for so many different reasons, but we need to work on prevention and on healing, so to speak, where healing has a particular meaning because it means to observe something, to look at something, to recognize that there is a problem. So, well, if the country is more interested in inaugurating new buildings than maintaining the existing ones, this creates problems. So we need to have the patience to work on prevention, to have medium and long-term programs, to have a series of emergencies that are taken into account. And if there are risks in a certain area, this area should have priority over other areas. So we need to take decisions that are more operational, so to speak. What do we inherit from the past? Since 1945, there have been expenses that are to repair damage over 245 billion, and so many lives were taken as well. So these are two aspects that we have always kept in mind. And we have tried to learn from our experience and to create new mechanisms that will help the involvement of the civil society, the technical experts. Italians traditionally love their homes because they see it as one of their main assets. So investing in prevention, and seismic prevention in particular, is extremely important. Today, when you buy a flat, you need to have the so-called energy certification. If the house does not consume too much energy, it has a higher value. And you know that the costs for the energy are very high in a household. So if we have a Class A house, this means that households can save money and that the house itself has a higher value. If we apply the same principle to the seismic aspect, when we talk about millions of buildings, this has an extremely important economic relevance in terms of public and private buildings. So we have taken into account two different aspects. First of all, the principles that make it possible for a house to be classified. We have the guidelines for the classification of seismic risk, vulnerability, danger for a certain building. So today, it is easy to understand if how your house would be classified on the basis of, obviously, scientific criteria. In my region, when in 2012 I was mayor, there was an earthquake. It was about 500 years that we did not have an earthquake in Emilia-Romagna, and well, nobody thought that it was at risk. So these indexes of danger are based on forecasts that are in a way limited. But today we have these guidelines for the classification of buildings, and you can then understand whereas your house is at a high or a medium or a low risk level in terms of earthquakes. So then one can actually take the measures that were explained by the other speakers, and you can actually detract about 80% of the expenses from your taxes. And so the first message that I want to give you here today is this. Do believe in securing, in making your house safety, because it is the government that covers the expenses, and it is a plan that is valid for 5 years. Also, the diagnosis is paid for with a contribution from the state. So this means also new jobs for our professionals. So this is something that makes the value of the building higher. So we took this decision in 2016 with the Renzi government, and in 5 years you can actually recover your expenses. So in a way, this has a weight of about 400 or 500 million per year. In 2022, we foresee to have a higher amount that is of the public budget that is due to these expenses. So this is an element that is extremely relevant from the seismic point of view. This great project called Casa Italia. Well, the name of the project itself would encourage us to take more care of our country. Because if a country is fragile, just like a person, it deserves more attention and more care. So let's take more care or better care of our country. This is a very important element of economic dynamism. And this is something I really would like to stress. The incentives for energetic requalification for the restructuring of houses in a moment when the construction sector was really in crisis after 2009, with the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. The only element that was actually positive in this very bleak situation was this incentive, this financial incentive for the reconstruction with 29 billion a year in terms of construction market. So if we can move the same interest to the seismic safety of houses, we can actually boost a new labor market, for instance, in terms of innovative materials, as well as new jobs for our professionals, of our young people, and this is another important element. We gave 60 billion euros in terms of incentives for the creation of photovoltaic plants. Well, we can do even more if we wanted to avoid our houses to fall down on the head of our children. And in 2014, we tried to create a plan to counter the geological imbalance, classifying the whole country according to the potential risk. So there is now a plan, but Italy, however, has the problem that often allotted investments do not arrive at the families that are taken as targets. 2.5 billion euros were not spent in terms of private houses and in terms of buildings in the field of education. So there is a problem of responsibility, of accountability in the whole chain of administration, of public administration. And this holds true also for earthquake and the reconstruction after an earthquake. So there is a vertical subsidiarity in Italy that calls for more accountability. The country cannot work if there isn't this responsibility, this interinstitutional sense of responsibility. So the great challenge that we have to meet is to reinforce controls at all levels to make sure that the money that is allotted for certain plans are really used, and those local authorities, for instance, that cannot use this money should be supported in doing so. Or could actually ask the help of, for instance, association of municipalities or of regions. This is an extremely important element to make sure that the money that we have is spent. So we need to reinforce the whole institutional chain, so to speak. It is very important to have a full involvement of all the institutional levels. The extraordinary example of the civil protection services, for instance, is extremely important. It is made up of municipalities, regions, and the state, but there are also, for instance, the fire brigades. I was in Amatrice immediately after the earthquake. I went there directly because, well, the Prime Minister asked me to do so. And there were a lot of volunteers of the civil protection services. There are so many of them. And they are just, well, ordinary people. And this collective work makes civil protection services so important and so beloved. But obviously, this cannot happen only in cases of emergency. We needed to work also in everyday life in order to grant safety. So this strong will to work together, to have our responsibilities very clear, and this is a key element also in terms of reconstruction. In a few days it will be the anniversary of the first earthquake. There was a first earthquake, and the second earthquake was the strongest earthquake that happened in Italy in the last 20 years. So it was for those communities, it was really a very difficult situation for the families living there. So we must continue to support these people in their everyday life, because the real challenge is to go back to normal life, to have people that that fled elsewhere need to know that they can go back to their houses, to their villages, where a new economy can be start. We need years for reconstruction. This is another thing that must be said, but we have to be as quick as possible. Nevertheless, we need to be very clear and say that these villages need years to be rebuilt. But in order to be convinced to go back, these people need to know that they will be supported in terms of safety for their second houses, their holiday houses as well, because this is extremely important element for that area. So these incentives, these financial incentives, are also applied to holiday houses, and so these people need to know that their houses will be easily accessible in terms of transports. If there are only regional trains that can actually make commuting possible, then people will go back to live where they used to live. But if they needed to be on the road 50% of their time, they would not go back. So we need to have a vision. We need to have this goal to have the people going back and rebuild their region, their territory. So we need a long-term vision that can actually aim at supporting the structural weakness of this area. So that calls for the commitment of the whole of the Italian community. That calls for a lot of patience, because we really have to take it one step at a time. There is no easy way to get there. So it is only with an everyday involvement that we can find a solution for these problems, and also those problems that we inherited, because sometimes what we inherited does not need to be earned again, as the title of the meeting says, but needs to be abandoned. So this is what calls for a change in the way we work. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for the very reassuring way, so to speak, in which you talked, because it's a topic that calls for a lot of clear-mindedness. So really, I'd like to thank the Minister for his words. We still have a couple of minutes. If there are some questions, well, a short debate, if you like. So our speakers are welcome to intervene. Minister, you were talking about these certifications in terms of energy certifications. So they are now mandatory, if I'm correct. So a house can be sold only if it has its own energy certification. So this next step to make seismic certification mandatory is something that can be done, is something that can, I don't know, be feasible?
We are investing a lot in convincing people about the importance of this issue. Making some of these standards mandatory, for example, the certificates you mentioned for a building, could be a solution, but it needs to be done in a stepwise fashion. In Bolzano, unless you have a certain energy class, you can't sell a building. The market has regulated itself, if you like. The strength of some elements has made it possible not to overburden excessively the offices. But if this should not prove to be successful as it is expected, any government should consider, in my opinion, the idea of making it mandatory, because it's a cost for the family, for the individual, for the community. So it's something that is being discussed, striking the balance between obliging and convincing. It's a matter of philosophy, if you like. In this phase, we hope that the people will be convinced. But also, in the future, there might be something more stringent and mandatory, because I think it's in everybody's best interest. Would Mr. Cerchiai like to add something? I think that the minister has depicted in a very clear way how an instrument can be used by the government, an incentive to encourage people to do things. This paves the way for new questions, incentives to do something. Then you need to see what the response is. The minister also said something which I agree with and would like to go back on, the fact that it is in everybody's best interest to make sure this happens. It can't be just a matter of securing my home because it's my choice. It's something that has to be encouraged. It has to happen, because otherwise I jeopardize, I create risk for other people's assets and lives. Think about a building with 3 flats. You upgrade 3, you leave 1 as it was. Then it's the building as a whole you should consider. So there's a general interest. I don't mean this as a provocation, of course, but this needs to be done. And in the long term, but it will also have benefits in the short term. And we need to encourage these efforts in a significant way. We can't leave it to the individual choice. Of course, we can support people in the lower income brackets. We need to pay attention to this, but we need to do this. Also, the minister said, we know a lot has been done in this regard. 10 years ago, we knew much less. 5 years ago, less. Now we know a lot. We have areas of danger. We have priorities. So we need to do this. As a citizen in the country, the attitude is, I trust the government as a mother who will intervene if necessary. We have a sort of bonus attitude, indemnification attitude. So individual resistance to react needs to be encouraged. The time has come for the government to say, I am willing to give incentives for a certain number of years, but unless you use them, if there is a disaster in 4 or 5 years' time, you will be responsible for the consequences. Otherwise, things will always remain the same. You need to use the carrot and something else, okay, not say the stick. I'd now like to leave the floor to the architect. As regards this topic mentioned by the minister in such a clear and effective way, my view is that on opinion or a question, the housing bonus, if you like to call it this way, it has been defined in this way, casa bonus, I think is extremely effective if it becomes part of an attitude where you call upon a professional for upgrades and changes, if you have the impression, to put it bluntly, that you are adding value, you are gaining something. And this also means, involves not only the technical stage, but also the general look and feel of the building, as the English speakers call it. So it is excellent. That needs something that needs to be designed in view of this final prospect. Do something that will make you feel safe and something that can be sold at a higher price than what you have now, of course. Yes, we'll add this to our proceedings. I think that the earthquake bonus is exceptional, excellent. The part that can be used by taxpayers for seismic upgrading of their houses is essential. But also the thing you made about demolition, because also having the demolition component was very important. What we need to do is to encourage awareness, and also we need a sort of electroshock therapy. Often we see issues and problems in houses, blocks with 3 or 4 stories, where it's difficult to work in an aggregate way. So we need to kind of reward, not in economic terms, because 80% is already a good amount, but also in terms of size of square meters. We need to make up for something that might be missing or unwilling. So in that way we will encourage this kind of effort. And also, because the key word is prevention, we could consider rewarding the use of materials that are part of a circular economy in view of the future. We are nearly approaching the conclusion of our round table, of our panel. I would just like to add one element. In Torre Annunziata we had a house collapsing, people died. It was a structurally caused collapse. One of the many large-sized houses, especially in the south, made of cardboard, if you like. Anything will bring them down, will cause them to collapse. I know that as a minister you are very interested in raising awareness. You mentioned this in terms of awareness as citizens. And prevention is something that the media should insist on. And I, as a journalist, realize that I'm responsible for this too. But in an emergency, there are other hot news items, if you like. And the public administration, in its day-to-day efforts, should be in a position able to raise awareness. You said that it would be better, it is preferable for us to work in a stepwise fashion. Before making anything mandatory, you could try and convince people. It's what you said. So, to sum up, what could you say about this topic, which is so important for you? Well, just very, very briefly. In Italy, unfortunately, there are causes of disasters due to building too much, often illegally. So I insist that we need to demolish illegal buildings because, of course, if you decide that a building should be demolished, but it's still up and standing 10 years later, you are failing your institutional duty. Of course, there are priorities. First of all, you demolish buildings belonging to the mafia or holiday homes, but you must make sure that the law is upheld, also for safety reasons. In Italy, I was going through chapter 33 of the Betrothed, and there is something which is extraordinarily efficient. I don't want to open a whole new issue this. But in Italy, we have exactly this situation. Manzoni, in I Promessi Sposi, said there was common sense, but it was overcome, in a way, by the idea of building quickly, making do, and then this is trying to find shortcuts, whereas common sense says that a building of this kind is at risk, the safety of your family, of your neighbors, because we are, as in quantum mechanics, we are not individual items, we are interrelated. That's one of the great discoveries of quantum mechanics compared to classical traditional mechanics. Things are interrelated. They don't stand alone. They need to be studied together. So these shortcuts are to be avoided at all costs. And it's really very relevant. For example, in the earthquake bonus, we mentioned blocks of flats and the fact that people who don't have the ability can pass on their deduction in order to participate to safety measures in the blocks of flats, because this is a very substantial part of our building assets. We need to keep working diligently and make sure that the rules we have are respected, not just continue writing new ones. We don't always need new regulations, new standards. We should focus on few norms that are respected. We should focus on the relationship between public administrations, individuals, citizens, and companies. It's an Anglo-Saxon point of view. I don't calculate, first of all, what you should give me. I ask you to do a billion things. No, I ask you to do a few things, but make sure that you're doing them. That's what we should focus on. That's our priority. Thank you very much. And all the best for your work to everybody. Thank you.